Hey there, beautiful friends. Welcome to my channel. I'm really glad you're here. Today's video will be a bit more focused on some linguistic specifics, namely the words cisgender and transgender, which are often presented as opposites. In this video, we'll explore the consequences of these words, what they make possible and what they erase, and the frame that they provide. And then we'll consider possible alternatives and ways to recenter the people or ideas that have been erased by this dichotomy. At the end of this video, I'll leave you with 3 questions that can help make better sense of your own position in relation to these terms, and which will help set the stage for my next video, where we will take the ideas we explore regarding gender today and apply them to broader frames of understanding. So, when I first began to interrogate my gender, like many others, I sought the perspective of those who had already been testing and exploring the boundaries of gender before I even arrived at the question. And one of the voices I found along the way was that of Ida Viloria, who identifies in their blog bio as, quote, a Latinx author and pioneering intersex and non-binary activist and educator. I read their book, Born Both: An Intersex Life, the year it came out in 2017, and it is a book I highly recommend, as Viloria speaks powerfully and personally about their experiences as an intersex non-binary person and the perspective it has offered them on life. And today, I would like to engage a suggestion they make in that book, as well as one which they developed at greater length in a prior blog post, and I'll include the link to that post in the description of this video if you're interested. But in sum, they advocate against the use of transgender and cisgender as opposites. Specifically, they argue against the word cisgender, primarily on the grounds that construing trans and cis as opposites contributes to the erasure of intersex people, who, regardless of what gender performances they choose, being born neither male nor female, trouble the sex-gender relationship often used to categorize people between a trans and cis dichotomy. And that intersex non-binary people, like Viloria, would be categorized as cisgender by some definitions, but transgender by others, and that neither categorization reflects their unique position as an intersex person. Viloria also remarks in one of the comments to this blog post on the fact that cisgender is not a term chosen by and for the people it refers to. That is, so-called cisgender people did not choose the term for themselves, but were assigned it, which is rarely a good sign for substantive ethical consideration. Not to mention, many people who the term cisgender theoretically applies to still do not even know what it means. I believe that Viloria's argument is strong, even while I sincerely doubt that there is a large chance we will eliminate the word cisgender anytime soon. Admittedly, it's a word which I have struggled to remove from my own vocabulary, even while I recognize and agree with the nature of its unethical erasure of intersex folks. So I really want to spend some time today exploring Viloria's proposed solution and the use of the words trans and non-trans as 1, language which centers the experiences and needs of trans folks, and 2, does not contribute to intersex erasure in the same way, but simply leaves intersex inclusion or exclusion from the label of trans up to individual intersex people and their own self-articulation. I believe that the criticism which Viloria raises against the term cisgender could be applied to many sets of so-called opposite pairs. Consider the opposites of day and night, which erase times like dusk and dawn in a way that non-day or non-night do not. Or cold and hot, which erase lukewarm, cool, and so on. Hard and easy, beautiful and ugly, light and dark, examples abound. And this is perhaps an obvious point when applied to these arranged opposites, but it is something we often take for granted, especially when applied to functional categories like men and women. The issue with all of these pairs is that both terms are positively construed. Both are given their own respective definitions, but are then configured as opposites. That is, they are made to be binaries, when in reality, they are much more complex situations which are linguistically manipulated to become binaries. And we would not have this issue if we were to more simply define things by their negation. That is, we could successfully sort the world into the categories of women and non-women, but sorting everyone into women and men requires some serious force and erasure. Not only are these fabricated binaries more violent, they also offer a less honest or nuanced picture of the world. This is not a new idea. Really, all I am describing is the fact that much of our language and thinking is predicated on false dichotomies. But what Valoria's argument and the countless lives lost and harmed by senseless gendered violence demonstrate is that failing to recognize false dichotomies and name them for what they are is costly. And choosing to ignore the limitations and inaccuracies of the language we choose is unethical. That we can do better, and should at least try. But undoing false dichotomies is a lot easier said than done. Even as someone who is sought after non-binary, gray area, in-between spaces of being, I find myself continually discovering how much of life is inherently gendered, how utterly little space of culture and expression remains untouched by the categories of masculine and feminine. As a result, so much of discerning my own euphoric gender expression has been working through the scripts of the opposite gender, in my case, femininity, to see what fits and what doesn't. But when we say these dichotomies are false, or that they are socially constructed, this should not be taken to mean that they are inconsequential. Quite the contrary. Gender norms are some of the most pervasive and consequential norms active in our lives today, and they are insidious because we have perpetuated them for so long that we hardly even pay very much attention to how totalizing they are. And while there are many brave people who find ways of consistently troubling people's expectations or assumptions regarding gender, no one can assume the weight of this task all the time. And even people who do it majority of the time, or people who are offered very little choice in the matter, such as Valoria, people who literally cannot become socially legible in the bodies they were born with until we undo these false dichotomies, are erased by the language we currently use. And people still assume their gender all the time. No matter how genderless your performance, people will still project gender onto you. And even if we find ways of thinking and articulating ourselves personally or privately in expansive ways, until public consciousness and language evolves, none of us will be able to live lives free from the violence of gender. But I also do not believe that it is the job of trans people, and here I am using the term trans broadly to include anyone who identifies as gender transgressive, to undo the world's transphobia. We actually have quite enough of it to undo within ourselves. We undo it with our very lives, and we are hardly the ones responsible for organizing the world in this way. Furthermore, trans people are not the only ones who suffer from transphobia. Everyone does. Let me say that again a little more precisely and emphatically. Gender transgressive people are not the only ones who suffer from the forced sorting of the entire population into two narrow scripts of gender. Everyone suffers. I strongly agree with Valoria's assessment of the word cisgender as an unethical contribution to intersex erasure, and their critique of the imposition of labels and identities onto populations that do not self-articulate them, but I would like to press the matter farther. I believe that transgender and cisgender, presented as a false dichotomy, cause harm to all people by widening the perceived distance between those who are gender transgressive and those who perform their gender in more conventional ways. There is obviously value in naming the differences in experiences and needs between trans and non-trans people, but I perceive that many of the dangers which afflict trans people most immediately come from the misperception that we are somehow inconceivably different than non-trans people, resulting in our sensationalization, objectification, fetishization, or valorization, but rarely in a balanced understanding of our dignity or shared humanity. I've discussed in previous videos the danger of categorizing people first and foremost by their difference, as it reinforces ideas of distance, perpetuating exclusive language of us and them, rather than restorative or conciliatory understandings of the human populace, or even more accurately, the global populace, as a unified whole. It is not that I believe that trans concerns should be erased, or that we should pretend to live in some gender-blind society while gender reveal parties retain an upsetting degree of prominence. It is that the story of distance and difference between trans and non-trans people is true, but it is also incomplete. And I believe that our reliance on a self-definition under the single story of difference contributed to the creation of a term that erased our intersex siblings and ignored the ways in which all people are negatively affected by the false dichotomies of sex and gender. And this false dichotomy between trans and cis sediments in ways that harm all people. One of the most frustrating that I have watched play out again and again is in gender diversity or transgender competency trainings at schools, workplaces, and other organizations. These conversations are often framed in a manner of, these are the things you should know, respect, and practice to make trans people feel more comfortable and included. First of all, as if the trans community is even in agreement on best practices for things like inquiring someone's pronouns, preferred prefixes, and the like. Thus, many of the things taught by these trainings actually fail to represent the diversity and individualism demonstrated by many trans people. But even when gender education succeeds at preserving the nuance and complexity of trans concerns, under this paradigm, non-trans people tend to walk away well-intended, but still deeply confused. But what's worse, in my opinion, is that the non-trans people in the room seem to rarely internalize the things that are taught because they are never made to understand how these things affect their own lives. They are able to walk away from training such as these, or interactions with trans people, and forget or fail to apply half of what they've learned because overall, we perpetuate the idea that trans people are the only ones seriously affected by normative gender scripts. And when we all have a billion things on our mind at any given time, it's no wonder that people fail to substantively change collective thoughts or behaviors in the direction of greater inclusivity for as long as concerns of gender are categorized as a minority concern. If someone walks away from an educational interaction and their biggest takeaway is that they should wait for people to self-disclose their pronouns, that's a good takeaway. But if that person has never been in a situation where they know what it feels like to experience discomfort regarding their own pronouns, it is incredibly unlikely that this practice will stick. Furthermore, if someone in my workplace respects my pronouns but fails to understand why it is harmful to make assumptions about me because of my body or gender expression, I'm still not going to feel safe around that person. But I believe there are ways of thinking and speaking about these things which are more inclusive, that can better include not only our intersex siblings, but also invite people into the conversation who have thought of themselves as entirely unaffected by transgender concerns. Because perhaps the real rub of transness is that the false dichotomy of male and female perpetuates violence, and this violence affects all of us. It results in children having expectations placed upon their lives and bodies before they even take their first breath. It creates a hierarchy of value amongst people who perform their assigned gender well, and those that do it less well. Those that are less beautiful, less macho, too emotional, too bossy, and so on. And the more I have come to understand my own gendered experience and engaged in conversation with trans and non-trans people alike, the more I have come to think about trans identities as canaries in a coal mine, rather than exceptions to a rule that is supposedly working. I genuinely believe that gender binaryism is dysphoric and violent in one way or another to every single person. Even if people would not change anything about their gender identity, expression, or performance if given full autonomy. As I explored in last week's video, the same perspectives and actions take on a different connotation when they are personally chosen rather than forcibly prescribed. And in a society with only 2 gender scripts, even people who have never felt particularly uncomfy in their gender are still affected by a lack of personal agency. And I believe that the trend of more and more young people interrogating their gender reveals just how rigid these norms are. That there are a lot of people who might experiment with gender if they felt more empowered to do so, or if it were less risky, but simply cannot admit this to themselves given how high the stakes are. These high stakes around gender norms cause misperception and painful expectations for all of us, not just those of us who feel it strongly enough to take action or transgress the norms. So now, several years after Valoria's proposal, I believe that unfortunately, it is unlikely that we will abandon the word cisgender. But I do believe we could stop using it to describe a category of people, and instead use it as a referent for a certain kind of privilege, which I believe is closer to its original intent anyway. Thus, cisgender privilege would be the benefits which a person experiences as a result of feeling little to no pressure to interrogate their sex or gender. This move would name the privilege itself for what it is, and its opposite would be anyone who does not experience this privilege, including but not limited to intersex people, trans people, non-binary people, and gender variant or gender transgressive people. For instance, butch women or effeminate men who experience less social privilege as a result of their deviant expression, even while they may never identify as another gender. And under this definition, perhaps even those marginalized subsets within binary gender identities could be spoken of as lacking cisgender privilege if they fail to perform their gender well, or are consistently harassed or denied inclusion because of it. It is important to note here that this move would also invite thinking along a spectrum of privilege. In the same way that someone who is rich could be a millionaire or a billionaire, and both are indeed rich, but the degree of their privilege of wealth varies significantly. Similarly, someone who is trans would have next to no cisgender privilege, as they rarely, if ever, have the ability to forget their gender transgression, while, say, an effeminate man might experience less cisgender privilege when interacting with his homophobic uncle, but might experience more when running his own business, because the stakes and cost of gender transgression are not the same everywhere in every instance, but depend upon the intersection of other factors. Further, this would allow us to take up Villoria's proposal of the terms trans and non-trans. I would advocate for the acceptance of trans as both an umbrella term, one which continues to include non-binary and genderqueer or gender-questioning folks, but also as a specific term, transgender, as one which refers to the self-articulation of those people who have created a livable life by switching scripts, as it were. Even if we recognize that these scripts are limited, it is not the responsibility of any individual transgender person to overthrow the gender binary. And by asserting their agency to become the opposite gender, they demonstrate that the scripts are indeed malleable. And the acceptance of this term in both ways can help remind us that there are as many different ways to be trans as there are trans people, just as there are as many different ways of engaging and performing gender as there are people on the planet. But by accepting a trans, non-trans binary, which deploys cisgender privilege to refer to a specific kind of shifting social position, we can also move away from the false assumption that simply because someone is non-trans, that they also experience cisgender privilege, and instead recognize that someone can lack cisgender privilege and still be non-trans. Not only would this offer greater inclusion for intersex populations who may not identify as trans, but assuredly lack cisgender privilege, but would also better reflect the many friends I have encountered, and I suspect there are a good many others out there, who feel deeply dysphoric as a result of the gender binary and their place in it, but who do not feel so dysphoric as to change their name, pronouns, body, or self-articulation. And I believe it is important that we do not erase or minimize the dysphoria of non-trans people, simply because it is not large enough to result in visible social action. Respecting only the pain which we can easily see is foolish, ableist, and unjust. But what's more, it continues to perpetuate the idea that trans people are pathological, that there is something wrong with us instead of something wrong with this system, a system which hurts all of us, whether we can name it or not, and which attempts to sort the diversity of the world into two rigid categories. So, this was a much more technical video than some of my previous ones have been, but I promise that in our next one we'll examine how it is much more than the cisgender-transgender divide that creates a false dichotomy, that false dichotomies are all around us, and that their consequences are very real, but that by naming them, better understanding them, and working to shape our language to better reflect the complexity of our lives, that we can imagine better forms of framing and understanding that cause less harm, offer greater inclusion, and represent the world in a more collectively honest manner. But for today, I will leave you with 3 questions that will hopefully make better sense of today's video in light of your own life, and help you discover new ways of thinking about things that often go unexamined. So first, imagine the most vivid conception of masculinity that you can. Consider what it looks like, sounds like, feels like, and what it makes possible, as well as what it struggles with. With this conception in mind, What is something you really love or admire about masculinity that you wish you could see more of in your own life? And inversely, what is some element of masculinity that doesn't feel great to you, that you are happy you have some space from or might wish to escape further? Second, now imagine the most full and vivid conception of femininity that you can. Again, considering its postures, aesthetics, expressions, anything you can think of as feminine, and ask yourself the same question. What is something that excites you about femininity, that makes you feel good, and how can you better incorporate this into your own life? And what is something about femininity that doesn't feel quite so good to you, that you struggle with, or that you might enjoy greater distance from? Third, regardless of your identity, in what ways do you feel or have you felt misunderstood, misrepresented, or dysphoric because of binary scripts of gender? What are the pieces of yourself that you have been taught to give less attention to, or which have been made to feel smaller because of the gender norms in which you were socialized? If you enjoyed today's video or it meant something to you, please give it a thumbs up and click subscribe. Your support means a great deal to me as I want to provide reflections which speak to you. And if you're feeling brave and vulnerable enough to share any responses you had to today's questions, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I wish you peace and perspective. I love you all as I love myself, as we are part of the same world, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. If you would like to know more about me or this channel, you can find that video right here. If you would like to check out my first series of videos on naming and framing, you can find that playlist right here. And if you missed last week's videos on the relativity of good and bad and the ability to transform your perspective, you can find that right here.